Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of comics like Preacher, Hitman, Fury Max, and the recently released TKO Studios series, Sara. It's Garth Ennis. Thanks for coming on, Garth.
Hey there. Nice to be here.
So, we're going to be talking about Sara here in a little bit, which is a new TKO Studios six-issue series that I absolutely love. But I want to start by looking back on your love of war stories and like what the foundation of that was. I know you wrote the intro to a collection of the British weekly series Battle at Titan. So
that's right. Yeah.
Was that what were the foundational building blocks for your love of war stories in general?
Well, it would have been indeed in comics, in British war comics. Battle was a weekly, like most British comics of the time. It was a weekly anthology, 30 pages, mostly black and white, say 6 or 7 stories. There were also a series of what were called picture libraries, and these were smaller format, I think about A5, 60 pages, 2 panels per page, black and white. About 4 of them released monthly, I think, and they were war stories. War Picture Library, Battle Picture Library. There was another series called Commando, and these really made up the majority of my comics reading childhood. I also read 2000 AD, the famous sci-fi anthology that launched Judge Dredd, but it was really the war stories I concentrated on, not having access to American comics at all as a kid. I really only had mainstream British titles, and that was where I suppose my love of war stories began. I think it probably survived largely because having read the war comics and then finding out that in fact these were based in reality, that the characters and stories I was reading had real life equivalents in World War II, World War I, Vietnam, and others. I think that's why they stayed with me in a way that a lot of the fiction I would have been reading at the time didn't. Mm-hmm. It certainly helped that they were so well done, so many of them. That certainly helped them stay with me, but it was the fact that people had done these things, that men and women had done these things, and that I could read more about that in history and memoirs. That I think is what really put the hook in me there.
So have you expanded beyond that? I mean, I'm sure you read plenty of books and things about that. But are you, are war stories something that appeals to you across all mediums? Like, you're a big fan of films, TV, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I will always hunt them out. Film, TV, whatever. Even novels. The few kind of examples of military fiction that are still published today. So yes, it is a pretty broad interest of mine.
Yeah, it's always been a big thing for me too. Like in particular, probably my favorite television series ever is Band of Brothers.
Yeah, that's a tremendous show. It really is.
It is, and I actually just recently started rewatching it, and I was posting something about it on Twitter, and it's interesting because somebody tweeted back at me and they said that they used to be a soldier, and it's actually hard for them to watch because they got it so right, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting show for a number of reasons, and one of them is I think it seemed to appeal beyond the usual war movie or war show audience. I know a lot of people who aren't normally interested in that kind of material who do like Band of Brothers, and I think that's because HBO worked hard to solve some of the problems you usually have with war stories. Most obviously that everyone wears the same uniform, and they all wear a helmet that kind of puts a line directly above their eyes. and their faces are usually pretty grimy, and it becomes very, very hard to tell people apart. And I had the impression that they deliberately cast people in Band of Brothers who you definitely couldn't mistake for one another.
Mm-hmm.
They realized that Damian Lewis, playing Dick Winters, would be spending a lot of time with, I can't quite remember the chap's name, but he plays his best pal, Nixon.
Yeah, Ron Livingston.
That's him. And they realized, okay, these two guys are going to be spending a lot of time next to each other. Let's make sure they look nothing like one another.
Yeah.
And there are several other examples of that in the show, and I think that's part of its appeal, because what turns a lot of people off war stories, I think, especially, live action, is that it is very, very hard to follow the characters. Sometimes it's hard to remember who's who.
Mm-hmm.
I thought Band of Brothers dealt very well with that in a way that, sadly, the Pacific didn't.
Right.
I think they took a lot for granted on the Pacific, and they didn't really apply the lessons they'd established in Band of Brothers, which is too bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is funny when I think about that. I've never actually thought about how different everybody looks, but if you look at somebody like a character I really like, and that is Garnier. And
nobody else looks like that guy.
He kind of looks like a Mark Buckingham drawing come to life. Like he's got that big jaw and everything like that. And then Liebgott. I mean, there's so many different characters in there that just really stand out from one another. That's really interesting. I never thought about that before.
I don't know. I mean, maybe it just ended up that way. Maybe they didn't actually set out to do it, but it does strike me that the characters are very memorable, and a big part of that is the casting.
Mm-hmm. So you talked about how when you realized that this was kind of, war stories are built off of reality, that was a big appeal to you.
Mm-hmm.
But when you actually started writing them yourself, what was it about war stories and kind of how they look at the human condition that really appealed to you as a writer?
Well, I think when you mention the human condition, that really is central to it. When you read a good deal of military history, particularly military memoirs, when you talk about people's personal accounts of what they experienced, you run across a great deal of material that is so wild, so far out there, that you realize you simply could not make it up. You could not believe it if it wasn't clear that it had actually happened. I've said this before, but I feel that there are things that happen in real life, particularly that very razor sharp edge of real life that war represents, that utterly defy fantasy and fiction, that, as I say, you cannot make up. And it's those stories that I like to explore. They're the ones I like to get at.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I really enjoy about your work, I mean, I like a whole lot of what you've done, but one of the things I always think is really amazing is how you've managed to inject war stories into unexpected places. Like, Nick Fury is a natural fit. Like, Fury Max is a character, is a series that I absolutely love. The Punisher, the Platoon series that you did recently, both with Goran Parlov. I mean, those are natural fits. But even something like Hitman. Hitman was a book that was built on a bunch of people who basically were bonded over their connections to war. And like that's a really interesting thing. But one thing I'm curious about in regards to being able to work those types of stories into atypical places like a Marvel or DC series, was that ever difficult? Was like trying to make something like that ever had to like kind of push at with editorial, or was editorial always largely supportive?
No, they've generally been pretty good. In the case of Hitman, it was obvious that Tommy had learned some basic degree of weapons handling and marksmanship somewhere, and the military seemed the obvious place. In the case of the Punisher and Nick Fury, well, I think it's already established that they have military backgrounds.
Right.
So again, just a very natural fit. And, editorial at DC and Marvel have always been very happy to let me explore that. In fact, right now I'm in the middle of the first part of a new Punisher book, another Vietnam story, which will once again feature Nick Fury.
I have to say, Nick Lowe, who is I probably is editing you on that.
Yes, he is.
He has nothing but amazing things to say about you, and I always think that when you can find somebody in editorial that really speaks your language, like on Hitman. One thing I actually didn't realize until I reread it this year was that Peter Tomasi, now a very notable writer, was your editor on that book. And having somebody who really believes in what you're trying to do, and when you're trying to inject these horror stories into this larger landscape, like that seems essential to being able to accomplish these things.
Very much so. At mainstream companies like Marvel and DC, you really do need an ally. You need someone who gets it. Nick has always been he's always been very keen on me doing these sort of military Punisher and Fury stories. And he's to be fair though, he's managed to garner a good deal of support from. I suppose senior figures at Marvel. I mean, Dan Buckley has always been happy to have Nick encourage me along these lines. Going back to DC, yes, Pete was absolutely vital because we needed someone to kind of navigate Hitman through the murky waters of DC. A lot of what went on in that book was quite near the knuckle, and Pete was very good at picking his moment, maybe in knowing when to ask, what the right time was to ask one of the senior editorial figures whether or not we could do something, whether or not we could use something, and he also knew when not to ask anyone anything at all. And so it's having that kind of editorial ally that will take you a long way in doing these books at Marvel or DC.
For sure. So let's talk about Sara, which is your new series with at TKO Studios with artist Steve Epting, colorist Elizabeth Breitweiser, and letterer Rob Steen. That's I'll do the quick pitch. This is what it says in the TKO site: a team of female Russian snipers attempting to beat back Nazi invaders on the World War II Eastern Front. I want to talk about the development of Sara. Where did you start in creating a story like that? Like, do you have like foundational ideas or like areas you'd like to explore when you're developing something like this?
Very much so, yes. It almost all my war stories start with me encountering a story in some military history or military memoir that I'm reading and thinking, yep, that one, that's a good one for a story. I've always been interested in the women soldiers and aircrew that Russia put in the line in World War II. I first encountered one of the characters, again, in a comic I read as a kid, and I was intrigued. Russia had, many thousands of women in uniform during what they call the Great Patriotic War, which is World War II. You could say this is because that equality between the sexes is part of the ethos of Marxist-Leninism, or you could just say that so many men were getting killed that they needed to make up the numbers somehow. But women did pretty much every military job we're familiar with today. They flew aircraft, they crewed tanks, they were medics, machine gunners, and a great many of them were snipers. I think there was one woman who quite famously racked up 300 kills or something like that.
309. Ludmila Pavlichenko. I said 309. I was actually reading about her. Ludmila Pavlichenko.
Yes, that's her. Yes, I think she quite famously met Eleanor Roosevelt when she was sent to the U.S. on a kind of a publicity drive or something, to highlight Russia's contribution to the war. And she's supposed to have met Eleanor Roosevelt, and Eleanor asks her, "So how many men have you killed?" And she says, "Not men, fascists, 309."
Yeah.
So stuff like that, is just too good to leave alone.
Right.
So I've written about the pilots. I wrote the Night Witches stories in the Battlefield series that Russ Braun drew. I like writing woman characters anyway, and I like writing World War II stories, and I like writing battlefield stories rather than perhaps secret missions and black ops, the kind of stuff that we like to think is so crucial in war, but actually pales in significance to what goes on the battlefield. And so in World War II terms, then really if you're going to write woman characters on the battlefield, that means Russia. That's really the only way there is to do that. And so I wrote about the Night Witches. I've written shorter stories featuring other characters, but I knew that eventually I was going to come around to doing a story about snipers, and Sara is it.
Yeah. I have always really been fascinated by snipers. I don't know why that is. But the women snipers of Russia part was very interesting. I was reading a lot for this, and I think according to their numbers, and who knows if this is completely accurate, there was something like 2,498 women snipers in Russia during World War II, and like that is something I never knew before reading this story or researching this, and it's really fascinating because, like you were saying, it's like by and large, the rest of the both the Western and Eastern Front and the Pacific Theater were just men, and Russia was a little bit different. But I did want to ask, like, one of the most interesting characters in the story to me is Risa, who is a member of the NKVD, or the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs.
Yeah.
Were you interested in exploring how Russia approached war to that point? Because the NKVD kind of seems like this umbrella that's looming over it, because they were effectively, I mean, you could call them patriots, but they were also just, I don't know, they were almost as big of a problem for a lot of Russians as...
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. They were, to all intents and purposes, the secret police. They were the forerunners of the KGB. They were there to encourage morale, and sometimes that meant people like Risa going around keeping an eye on the other soldiers, making sure that ideologically their morale is everything it should be, that they're committed to the fight. Sometimes it meant units who would set up machine guns behind attacking Russian troops and tell them, if you turn around and run under enemy fire, we will definitely kill you. So you'd better complete the attack as ordered. That's not to say that the NKVD themselves, that many of their own troops didn't fight very bravely at the front. They did, but it's impossible to get away when you're looking at Soviet Russia in World War II. It's impossible to get away from this quite grim situation that ordinary Russian soldiers, men and women, find themselves in. They've got the Germans in front of them, and then they've got the secret police at their own back. And that, I suppose, even though she comes across as quite a foolish character, maybe even a little bit cuddly, Risa is a personification of that. When Sara talks to some of the other girls, it's obvious that there are things they cannot say, cannot talk about in front of Risa, because they're living in a totalitarian state. They're really defending one totalitarian state against the invasion by another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of the most interesting facets of the story is the fact that probably the sweetest character in the entire story, Risa, is maybe the most like horrifying one of the lot of them, and that's including Vera, a character who is both a sniper and somebody who is very enthusiastic about torturing people, and Sara, who is like basically the Ludmilla Pavlichenko of the story, and Risa, like, just her cuddly nature offsets, but it kind of underlines how scary she really is, because if she says if she overhears the wrong thing and says it to the right person, all of them are done. They're just done.
Yes, exactly. In fact, you could even say that Risa being as ideologically committed as she is, would have no choice but to report what she heard. She does give the impression of being extremely committed to her work, but behind that sort of silly, possibly cuddly exterior is the full machinery of the NKVD and the Russian secret police. She potentially is every bit as lethal to Sara and the others as the Germans.
Mm-hmm. You know, when I was researching this, I actually went back and watched Enemy at the Gates, the sniper movie with Jude Law and Ed Harris and everything. And that was actually the first time I'd ever seen that the Russians would shoot their own soldiers when they retreated.
Yes.
Do you feel like the Eastern Front in World War II is relatively underrepresented in like wider fiction? Because it seemed like when I was reading Sara, I was kind of astonished by how little, even if it's not a completely true story, like how little of just like the structure of the Russia side of things I really knew.
Yes, I think it is very much underrepresented. We know now that Russia's contribution to the defeat of Nazi Germany was massive compared to our own. I believe it's true that the Russians were responsible for something like 90% of German casualties. They effectively got the job done. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, you have to draw a distinction between beating Nazi Germany and fighting a war of liberation, which the Russians most certainly were not doing. Mm-hmm. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, they did not, whatever else you can say happened when the Russians kicked the Germans out, they were not liberated. Whereas on the other hand, the Western Allies, Britain and America, well, I think it's very fortunate for France, Holland, Denmark, Norway, and so on, that Britain managed to stay in the war in 1940, because if the Americans and British hadn't invaded from the West in 1944, the Russians would have gone all the way to the English Channel and possibly beyond it. Mm-hmm. I think Stalin at one point, I believe there was a British general or possibly American who made some remark to him about taking Berlin and said, "Well done, Supremo, you went all the way to Berlin." And Stalin snorted and said, "Tsar Nicholas went all the way to Paris." So you can see that he had certain strategic designs that went way beyond the notion of liberation. Right. But anyway, that's to digress a little bit. Yes, Russia and its story is very much underrepresented. Although, to tell you the truth, the more I read, I think the great untold story of World War II is it actually takes place in China, where China's war begins with the Japanese invasion in 1931, and by 1945, I believe the Japanese have killed 15 million people. And that, by the way, is a figure that some Chinese historians will double. Mm-hmm. And no one knows about this. This was China's Holocaust, but no one knows about it, and the perpetrators got pretty much clean away with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did not know that at all. And I've watched and read a lot about World War II. That is one of the interesting things about these types of things is it's such a, it was taking half the planet was involved at that point. It really was a world war. And so it's like, it's hard to know all of what was going on then. Like, I imagine there's a huge part of people that were involved that had absolutely no clue that things were like that were happening, especially at the time. Obviously, communication was a completely different thing at that point.
Yeah. Yeah. There's actually, on that subject, there's a book I would recommend by a historian called Max Hastings, and anyone interested in what we're talking about might do well to pick it up. It's called, it was published in the US as Inferno, and I wouldn't go as far as to call it a people's history of World War II, but it tries to encompass as much or as many varied experiences of people who lived through the war as humanly possible. Everything from the memories of a Leningrad housewife to an American general to a British fighter pilot to a Chinese soldier who fought for Mao Zedong. You are, as you say, talking about a conflict that essentially took in half the planet. 60 million people were dead by the end of it. There were so many and varied experiences came out of the war. The book does do a reasonable job of trying to get a handle on that, and it is one I would recommend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is. I'll definitely check that out. There are a lot of really interesting stories. One of my favorite random ones is have you ever heard of Wojciech? I think it is the brown bear who worked with Polish soldiers during World War II, is like helping them lift artillery.
Mm-hmm. Go on.
Oh no! I mean, basically, the gist of it is they had escaped from, if I remember correctly, basically they'd escaped from Russian prisons, and they were going through North Africa, or I think they were going through Afghanistan. They came across a Syrian brown bear, and they kind of adopted him, and he kind of joined their ranks, and they ended up bringing him, I believe, to Italy with them, and he was helping them. He was, the kind of befriended by.
Actually, yes, this is starting to sound familiar. I think I may have seen a photograph of him.
Yeah, I mean, he ended up helping them lift artillery when they were, because it turns out bears are very strong.
Yeah.
And, that's one of those stories at the same time that you think, I don't know how much of this is true and how much of this is fable at that point. But, I mean,
yeah.
that's kind of the nature of world wars, is like sometimes it's hard to separate those two things.
Mm-hmm.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Yo, everybody. I'd like to take a minute to talk about our sponsors over at Impact Theory Comics. Impact Theory Comics is a new independent publisher, and they're releasing their first comic, Neon Future. Neon Future is a collaboration with world-famous DJ and producer Steve Aoki, and is written by the Eisner Award-winning writer of Justice, Jim Kruger, with artists Neil Edwards of Fantastic Four fame and Jeremy Rappak delivering the visuals and building the world. Want a first look at the book and Neil and Jeremy's art? Give Impact Theory a follow on Instagram at @ITComics. If you like what you see and you're a fan of science fiction, this might be the comic for you. So head over to your local comic book shop and get Neon Future #1 on your pull list ASAP. And now, back to the show. But I want to talk a little bit more about your approach for this writing and the overarching story. I don't want to go into too many specifics about it, but Sara learns a grenade trick from her mentor. And,
right.
and it's kind of a recurring theme in the story. Was that a foundational idea? Was that something that you kind of figured out early on and knew it was something that was going to be bigger than just a thing that she does?
Yes, frankly, I did. It's obviously, a certain aspect of the plot is resolved that way, but it also stood for Sara's perhaps shaky grip on her own humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Her leader and best friend, Rena, comments on this. She doesn't order Sara not to do it, but she is a little edgy about her doing it. I suppose it's a question of exactly what the phrase total war means. But essentially what Sara's doing is she's removing the pin from a grenade, placing it under the body of someone she shot so that the weight of the body keeps the spoon against the grenade. And so that later on when her victim's comrades come along and roll the body over to check on him, of course the grenade flies out, the spoon flies free, and the grenade goes off and gets one or maybe two more enemy soldiers. So this is, I suppose, a dirty trick, or it's fair enough in what is a pretty grim human pastime anyway, warfare. At one point, Sara herself says she doesn't see any point in being nice about it. There's no nice way to do the job. She describes it as being like tiptoeing through hell.
Mm-hmm.
But it does stand as an example of her perhaps losing her grip on her humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something I wanted to gently remind people of from time to time, that what this person does, what she's turned herself into, is a kind of emotionless killing machine in a way that the other women in her particular unit perhaps haven't.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is one of the things that marks Sara out. Of course, if you read the story, there's a good reason for this. Sara has a secret of her own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought that was a really, first off, I mean, I guess from a pragmatism standpoint, it's a great trick, but at the same time, it is something that really, as you said, underlines how she's kind of losing touch with her humanity and what can happen to you when you're in these types of situations, and when you're looking at everything in a, like, the very first sniping scene in the first issue, where she's just waiting and waiting and waiting in a tree. Like, that whole scene, everything is like, there's almost a value system to it. She's like, I don't want to raise attention until the right time. Like, maybe I could take out all these people beneath me, but I have to wait for this one main person because that's the objective. And
right.
It's not even, in some ways, it's not even like a human decision so much as it's like a math decision. Like, what is the right value in this situation? And it's fascinating.
Yes, you're quite right. It is like a sort of particularly ruthless piece of arithmetic. I think at one point Sara says she just didn't expect this. The war came along and changed her life along with everybody else's, and she never imagined she'd be in a situation where she'd automatically think that's a Nazi, not a man,
right,
before she pulls the trigger. And yet that's the mindset she's had to get herself into.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about the pacing of this story. War stories, I think a lot of times when people think about them, they think of them as more action-packed and everything like that. Mm-hmm. But this is certainly a slower and more patient war story. I mean, like I said, the first issue, I think maybe the first 3 words are wait. And I thought it was a great choice. But did you deliberately go with that, both for A, a sense of realism, and B, as a reflection of the fact you're dealing with snipers who are built around patience?
Both of those, yeah. And I should say, actually, it was reckoned at the time that women made very good snipers because they're generally more patient than men, so they don't mind waiting for the shot, although any successful sniper is going to possess that trait in abundance. Yes, it was very much that. I wanted to be as honest as I could, as accurate, but also as honest as I could about what it means to be a sniper. That it does mean essentially killing people. It's attrition of enemy personnel. It's winning by killing the enemy to protect your own people, so that there are more of them left at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to, I suppose, highlight as many different aspects of the sniper's job as well as the morality of it. So I wanted to show that a sniper will occasionally go after a particular target, and occasionally simply go out effectively freelancing, just looking for trouble,
mm-hmm.
Until they see a target of opportunity, like a squad of enemy soldiers, and will then begin to knock that squad off one by one. And occasionally a sniper will also take part in a major battle alongside other troops. And I wanted to get all of these into the story, really just to show the sort of many and varied things that a sniper would do.
Yeah, that last part is something that I don't think I'd ever experienced. It turns out snipers are not great against tanks. That is not one of their strengths.
No. Although, woe betide the tank commander who sticks his head up and thinks he's as invulnerable as the guys inside the vehicle.
Right.
But no, in modern warfare, in the kind of industrialized warfare that we've seen since, really, I suppose, since the Crimean War or the American Civil War, I think it's a truism that the largest number of casualties on the battlefield are generally caused by artillery, mm-hmm. and that is what can quite often win or lose a battle. And I wanted to make that clear, that Sara and her comrades' participation in the nighttime battle is important, but what ultimately decides it is simply a massive artillery strike.
Right.
Which is something that I think utterly dwarfs individual human characters anyway. The idea that you can drop a significant tonnage of explosive onto a particular map reference and simply wipe out everything living there, I think is quite an awe-inspiring, daunting thought for any individual who has to wander onto that battlefield.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, and the other thing about it too is like sometimes in those situations, if the artillery people just get it slightly wrong, next thing you know, they're hitting their own people, and there's certainly a lot of cost there.
Yeah, I mean, the very notion of friendly fire, of taking out your own troops simply by accident because somebody got a map reference wrong, or somebody didn't keep up with events and didn't realize that his own troops had advanced further than he thought. There are numerous ghastly instances of this. I think in the Normandy fighting after D-Day, there was an American offensive about to kick off when U.S. bombers got their map reference wrong and killed a couple of hundred of their own troops.
Yeah,
and that sort of thing happened more than once.
Mm-hmm. So, in terms of structure of the story, you spoke about this a little bit, but it kind of it goes back and forth between the present and the past.
Mm-hmm.
You could have approached that in a number of different ways. You could have done it linearly, in a linear fashion. You could have done it the way that you did it. Why was that the way that you wanted to do it to bring the most out of Sara's story?
Really, because I wanted to drop us in at the deep end and show her doing her job, but I also wanted there to be a sense that she does have some secret that is not so much driving her as kind of twisting and turning inside her. It's really what defines her. And so I wanted to move the action forward, move the current plot forward, while at the same time slowly and gently building up to the truth about what happened to her in the past that made her turn out the way she has. If you read it, you'll know how that happens. And sometimes this could be simply in a practical sense. You see her, I think in part 2, you see her settle down to start stalking and shooting at a German squad, and you then cut back and forth between that and her instructor showing her how the job is done.
Yeah.
So that's just a matter of practicality, Sara learning her trade. But there are other instances, of course, where you see conversations between Sara and Rena where Rena can't figure out what it is that's got Sara so twisted up. And Sara, of course, will reveal a little bit about her past, a little bit at a time. We see her early on, I think we see her consulting with an intelligence officer about what's happened, or what it appears has happened in her hometown, which at this point is behind German lines.
Yeah. So let's talk about, I want to ask about Steve Epting, who I don't believe you've never worked with. Have you ever worked with him before? Okay.
No, I was aware of him and liked his artwork, but no, we'd never worked together before. And I gotta say, I mean, the work he did on this was simply wonderful beyond belief. It turned out that we really did hit the ground running. An absolutely perfect match. If this isn't the nicest artwork that's ever been done on one of my stories, it's damn close to it. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely phenomenal. I mean, you can look at his artwork. I'd seen other things he'd drawn and think, oh yeah, this guy's good. But I had no idea that he was such a perfect match for my own work.
Mm-hmm. He did some Captain America stuff with Ed Brubaker, where he did actually went back on World War II quite a bit, and then they did Velvet.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, and then they did Velvet together, and but at the same time, it's like I never really thought of him for a story like this, but seeing it with him, he's such a good character actor, and he can bring so much mood to his scene, especially with Elizabeth Breitweiser coloring him, who is just incredibly. The thing that I think that she really excels at with her colors is creating a real atmosphere to a story, and they excelled in this.
Yes, they really did. I mean, Betty's work is terrific. She managed to make the characters so real and alive and vivid, but at the same time the story feels cold, and not just because it's always snowing. The story feels bleak and cold and harsh, which is just as it should, so that the little human moments are almost oases amongst all the harshness. And Steve, yes, I mean Steve is such a good, as you say, character actor. He solves that problem we talked about in terms of Band of Brothers. You have 7 women all wearing the same uniform and carrying the same equipment, and yet you can instantly tell who's who.
Yeah. Well, I was going to bring that up specifically for 2 different characters, Vera and Lydia is the younger one, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, like Vera has like an almost like kind of like Neanderthal type aggressive face to a certain degree. And
Yeah.
I think that's kind of reflective of who she is and how she approaches this. Meanwhile, like Lydia is very mousy and has like it's not even just like a look, it's like almost a posture thing and how she carries herself. And
Uh-huh.
and I think that stuff is amazing.
Yes, it is. I should say that the starting points for some of these characters, both visually and for me in terms of their personality, actually comes from a photograph. If you Google, I think it's 375 kills in one photograph or one picture, you should come across a photograph of 12 Russian women snipers in real life, that was taken in 1945. And these women are all carrying their rifles and they're all wearing their uniforms rather than combat gear, and they're all bedecked with medals. And some of them really just have those faces that make you want to know more about them. There's one in the bottom left who really does look like a child. She's killed 30 people, and yet she looks like a little girl in pigtails. Opposite her, there's this sort of behemoth of a woman who's grinning at you. They're all smiling, but not in any sinister way, except for this one on the bottom right, who was really the starting point for Vera.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not to say that the real life one would have been anything like the characters in the story. I should make that clear. These pictures were simply the starting point. I showed them to Steve and said, I think Vera should look like this. I think Liddy should look like that. In fact, you'll see a woman with curly hair who looks not unlike Risa.
Mm-hmm.
But again, this photograph, you'll get it probably if you just Google Russian woman sniper, you'll get it eventually. It's full of the kind of faces that, I suppose this is one of those comments on real life and how it once again defies fantasy. But it's full of the kind of faces that makes you want to know more about their owners, that starts you almost imagining personalities for their owners. So in a way, those were the starting points for a couple of the characters. Not Sara, though. I should say she was really created out of whole cloth.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I'd never really thought of like finding a photo like that and then kind of imagining their stories when you see them, like what led these women to this point, like who they are, et cetera, et cetera. But
yeah.
I mean, you can see it within Steve's art and within what you do with those characters. I mean, it's very reflective of them.
Yes. I mean, I should emphasize again that I am not saying that this is
Sure.
the story of the woman in the photograph. It's just a matter of using them as a sort of visual starting point.
Right.
That's all. But I think if you have a look at the photograph, you'll see what I mean.
Mm-hmm. So I just have a few more questions. I wanted to ask about a quote I came across in reflection of this book. You were asked about how you write, and you said that you got into the habit of thinking of stories as complete stories and not single episodes.
Yes.
That was an interview. And I thought that was really interesting, especially in regards to the TKO process and format of releasing everything at once, binge reading. When did that change for you, and why did you decide to approach stories in that way?
It would have been around the time of Preacher. Once I realized that everything, it looked as if from then on everything was going to be collected. And I think at this point, any comic book that comes out will eventually be a trade paperback. I started to think that this is how they're going to stay in print. This is how they're going to live so much longer than the monthly comics. And therefore, it simply makes sense to think in terms of complete stories, to think about something that will eventually be a book and read in one go. So it would have been back then. It meant that, from then on, when I approached longer stories like Punisher Max or The Boys, that I was thinking in terms of complete stories, beginning, middle, and end, rather than just individual issues.
Mm-hmm. Do you still think about ends of issues as like chapter breaks and like punctuation points where you want to hammer something at the end, or is that just part of the whole for you?
It's a little bit of both. You do want to make sure that there's enough in an individual issue to keep people coming back, but at the same time, you do understand that some individual issues are going to be more dialogue oriented, and some are going to be more action oriented than others.
Mm-hmm. I already mentioned TKO and their format. Why you worked with a lot of publishers? You actually
Mm-hmm.
kind of interestingly, it seems to me that a lot of writers and creators kind of find a home. They find a place
Mm-hmm.
that fits them. You work with a little bit of everybody. Why was TKO the place for this book?
When Sebastian Gerner, who I'd worked with briefly at Marvel, approached me about working for TKO, this was essentially what I had ready to go at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And it fit the format, a limited series, 6 issues, rather than an ongoing. It just so happened to be what was ready to go at that particular time. Every story finds its moment. When I have ideas, I start collecting other ideas to go along with them, and eventually the thing comes together, and then it's ready to go. Like the Punisher story I've just started.
Mm-hmm. But was there something that stood out about TKO over like an image or like a Aftershock or something like that for Sarah? What made TKO the right place for Sarah, I guess?
I think, as I say, it really was just a question of circumstance. As you say, I do like to work for a lot of different companies because I don't like to put all my eggs in one basket.
Sure.
And sometimes you reach the end of the road with people. That can happen. I like the idea of the binge release. I thought that was a really interesting idea. And because I'm always looking for new homes for my work, I thought, well, this looks like a relationship worth cultivating, and it does seem to be paying off quite well.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I really love about it, well, there's a lot of things I love about the whole approach, to be honest, but I love the binge release, and I love in the different formats they do it in. You can get it digital, you can get it in single issues and trade right at the start.
Yeah.
But then also the oversized format, because you got Steve Epting and Elizabeth Breitweiser. You want to make it a little bit bigger so you can appreciate it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, when the art and color is that good, you want people to be able to see it properly.
Does that binge release approach or the oversized format impact you at all as a writer?
Not really. No.
If you did another TKO book, though, would you change the way that you approached it? Or is it just the same?
No, I think it would generally be the same. I write my scripts the same no matter who's drawing them, the same no matter who's publishing them.
Mm-hmm. So, at the beginning, we've been talking this whole time about war. War is a thing that you're very interested in. And, when Sara came out, I have to admit, I saw some, hemming and hawing on social media about here's another Garth Ennis war story. And I'm fair or unfair, I personally, if you're good at telling a story and if it interests you, that's what ultimately matters. But does that perception bother you, or are you just about telling the stories that you have in you regardless of subject matter?
Very much the latter, yes. And if you think about it, the notion of anyone complaining about me writing yet another war story is, to my mind, somewhat ridiculous in a business where 99% of the time you have superhero comics written drawn and published by everyone
Mm-hmm.
over and over and over again. And given that each superhero comic is pretty much the same as the last one, and each individual issue is not far off the same as the last one, the question of repetition is not one that I think I'm the one who has to answer, to be honest with you.
Maybe the reason why your war stories stand out is because you might be the only person telling war stories in comics.
I probably am. And it's always the person who's different, who stands out, who gets noticed for this sort of thing. Here he is doing a war story again. Meanwhile, here's everyone else doing superheroes again over and over and over forever.
Right.
You look at it from that point of view, and I really don't think I have a case to answer at all.
No. I mean, especially because I was looking through your history of the books you've done with war. It's like you did 303, which it's a more modern story featuring a Russian soldier.
Mm-hmm.
You did Enemy Ace, War in Heaven, which is featuring a Luftwaffe pilot. You've told many involving American soldiers. Sara is a Russian soldier, a sniper
Mm-hmm.
no less, a sniper woman no less. I mean, it's not like everything you're doing is the same over and over. That is one thing that I wanted to ask you. I read an interview with you where you said, if you told me I'd spend the rest of my life in the industry writing only war stories, I'd be very content indeed.
Yeah.
How important is it to you to not just keep telling war stories, but finding new angles to approach these with?
It's not so much a question of new angles as wanting to tell new stories whenever something from my research or from my reading leaps out at me. And in a broader sense, my goal is to tell the stories I want to tell the way I want to tell them. That is my number one priority, and I try to make sure nothing gets in the way of that. Yes, it's probably true that I wouldn't kick too hard if all I had to do was war stories. Although that said, I do like writing crime. I do like writing horror. I do like writing comedy from time to time. So, there's more. I'm going to be doing more than war stories, but I am also always going to be coming back to them.
Mm-hmm. I did want to say one thing I noticed. You have not done a nautical story near as I can tell.
I wrote one called. I've written a couple actually. There's one in the first war story collection from DC, currently being published by Avatar, called Nightingale, which is about a British Royal Navy destroyer on the Arctic run to Murmansk. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, I did one called Send a Gunboat, which was about motor gunboat operations in the English Channel. So I have done nautical stories. It's funny, there used to be a strongly held belief in British war comics that you couldn't do what were called ship stories, because I think the theory was that there's something about a warship, a great sort of floating slab of dark grey iron that's too impersonal, as opposed to stories about soldiers on the battlefield or pilots in the air. And sure enough, you really didn't get ship stories, as they were called, that lasted very long. Although there was one, it was called HMS Nightshade, and it's in one of those Battle Classics collections you mentioned that I wrote the introduction for. It's by John Wagner, who created Judge Dredd, and I think it's an absolutely tremendous story. I will do more of those myself, as and when the opportunity arises. But yes, I will allow that it's just a little bit harder doing stories about war at sea as on land or in or as in the air.
I feel like Steve and Betty could tell a mean submarine story, to be honest.
Sure. Submarines are tricky, though.
Right.
They really are, because you're talking about kind of a lot of limitations when it comes to location. It's not going to change much. And it's hard to see your characters in relation to what they're up against, what they're fighting, because, of course, they're inside the submarine, which is under the water, and only one of them, the captain, is going to have this tiny view of the enemy through the periscope. So it's hard to relate your heroes to their enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, the other problem with submarine stories is you don't go very far before you run into Das Boot.
Right, exactly.
And how are you going to do a better one than that?
I think that is the problem with movies too. Is just like every time a new submarine. I remember when U-571 came out, everyone's like, "Oh, it's the next great, submarine movie," and everyone's just like, "This is just like a less good Das Boot." That's pretty much what it is, and that's the eternal comparison. Das Boot owns it.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, U-571, even though it has a script by David Ayer, doesn't exactly help itself because it's pretty much a fantasy. And it contains a lot of fairly ridiculous goings-on, things that simply don't make sense. For instance, there's a machine gun battle aboard the submarine with people blazing away at each other fairly near the start of the film. All you have to do is think about firing a machine gun in an enclosed space when you're surrounded by metal walls, and you can see what's going to happen there.
Right. Yeah.
So yes, that wasn't exactly a triumph there. Although, of course, yes, you're right. The comparison with Das Boot doesn't help. Personally, I got the impression that it was that film was made by someone who'd seen Das Boot at an impressionable age and always wanted to do one of their own.
Sure. Real last question for you. I related to all of the things you've said. It seems to me that no matter what you do, even when you're talking about something like Hitman, where it's it's existing in like the bartender is a demon named Baator who only says I am Baator. You have all these absurd characters, or even something like oh my God, Rover Red Charlie, was that the Apocalypse dog
right.
book?
The one about the dogs. Yeah,
I really enjoyed that comic, but I mean, like, both of those I think are indicative of how, to me, it feels like no matter what you're doing, if it's about a man on a quest to make God atone for his sins, you approach it with a real sense of realism. Is that something you want to imbue all of your stories with, no matter what the subject matter is?
I certainly try to make the characters relatable. I think if there's one thing that I'm pretty good at, it's writing dialogue. And I tend to write dialogue that is very down to earth and very believable, and as far as possible, I strive to catch the way people actually speak to one another.
Mm-hmm.
I like reading good dialogue. If I read dialogue that rings false to me, I can't really enjoy the story. I can't continue with it, and so I try to get it as right as possible. And I think it's possible because the dialogue in my stories is as realistic as it is, that might give the impression you're talking about, that might make the characters seem that bit more down to earth, realistic, believable, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
People, they come across as people, they talk like people that you know or could conceivably know.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if, looking back on it, if Frank Castle punching a polar bear fits more on the side of realistic or unrealistic, because it's a bad idea.
Well, that wasn't, as I recall, that wasn't exactly anything to do with the dialogue. I know. I see, although maybe the bear, did the bear say something?
I don't think so.
I think
he made a face.
But you can bet that if it did make a noise, it was a very realistic polar bear getting punched in the face noise.
I have to admit, I imagine that there is probably a small window where if you jumped into an enclosure where they would be really confused and maybe just far enough where you could punch them in the face and send them after some mafioso members. That's always possible.
It's not impossible. I mean, there's a good chance that if Frank hadn't punched it, it would have just wandered off and gone back to sleep.
That's true. In Alaska, I can tell you, this morning I had 2 moose in my yard, and by and large, wildlife wants to be left alone. They don't want to deal with people.
Yes, of course it does.
Yeah. But anyways, Garth, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I appreciate you taking the time.
No worries at all. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Before we go, I want to give a special shout out to Sean Kirkham, a.k.a. Big Clutch, one of Off Panel's patrons in another edition of Big Clutch's Beasts of the Week, where I highlight a creator or comic that blew me away recently. This segment will sometimes feature guests and sometimes not. This week, it's just me. And I'm going to highlight the new Daredevil series from Chip Zdarsky and Marco Cacchetto as my Beast of the Week. The second issue just came out recently, and it's another classic Daredevil run in the making, as Zdarsky, Cacchetto, and colorist Sonny Go are making a gorgeous and engrossing Daredevil story that builds off the stories that preceded it. It's really, really good, and one that I think will only get better and better as it moves along. I mean, seriously, if you like Daredevil, and I love Daredevil, this book is perfect for you, especially if you're already a fan of Zdarsky. It's bringing everything you love about that writer and over to a character you already love or a character that you probably know and are interested in. So shout out to Daredevil, this week's pick for Big Clutch's Beast of the Week. Look for this to close each week's episode, if not every week, then most every week. And thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Garth Ennis. You can find his work in the recent TKO series Sara, which you can find at tkopresents.com. If you're a fan of Off Panel, make sure to check it out on Patreon. If you back the show on there, you not only support it, but you get early access to each week's podcast, access to exclusive written and audio content, and more. Also, don't forget to subscribe to Off Panel on iTunes or Stitcher and give the show a rating or review while you're at it. You can find Off Panel on social media by liking it on Facebook at /sketched, that's SKTCHD, following it on Twitter at @sketchcomic, or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Wesley Gift, Sean Kirkham, Harry Small, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Greg Peterson, Gus, Andrew Scott, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Johan Brander, Paul Reinwan, Connor Farner, Vita Ayala, JDC and Matt Gagnon, Aditya Bidikar, Tara Ferguson, Dave Slusher, Kieran Mark Antonio, WMQ Comics, Akil, Greg Lockhart, Kokachi, Phil White, Ben Becker, Sean Pinello, Ken Heidelman, Philip Sevi, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, Nick Michelin, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Owen McCree, Brennan Fletcher, Gary Maloney, Jonathan Nilsson, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogert, Xavier Files, Maria Schweitzer, Matthew Taylor, Tyler Turner, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Braldy, Evan Blazer, Brian McRae, Ira James Udaskin, Modern Magic Stories, Nick Hall, Bruno Batista, Bobby Angus, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Phil Nall, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Benjamin Shipper, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Maxwell Schmidt, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Lou Iovino, Nicholas Kesslake, Greg Rucka, Adam Heifel, Nicholas Gardner, Andrew Corrigan, Fiona Staples, Chris Morris, Chris O'Halloran, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim DiMonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics and Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to the band Wolfpack, whose excellent track Outro from their album Volmilch opens the show. Give them a listen as they're totally rad. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.